Welcome to our National Association of Free Will Baptist Pastor Series. Today we have with us Dr. Brad Ransom of North American Ministries. He's the Director of Church Planning and the Chief Training Officer. And we're going to talk today about assessing yourself. So as you look at the slide, it'll say assess yourself. So we want to stop and think about who we are and what we are. And you may say, well, why should I bother with that? Well, the scripture says in Psalm 139, verse 14, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. In other words, it's helpful if we know about ourselves. We're all specially made by the Lord with particular talents, particular temperaments, and we don't usually quote Calvin on this show, but he did say something really good a few years ago, we'll say. Nearly all wisdom we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of two parts, the knowledge of God and ourselves. And so that's what we're talking about today, Dr. Ransom, is how as a pastor or church leader I can know about myself and how I can be more effective in the ministry. So welcome today, my friend.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Well, one of the things you do, Dr. Ransom, is you work with our church planters, and tell our listeners a little bit about that process, how you help them assess themselves to be better equipped to go into the ministry.
Okay. Yeah, for the last several years, we have instituted a assessment process that all of our church planters, potential church planters, when they're going through the hiring process, go through. And part of that assessment process is understanding ourselves better. And we use two different personality assessments that we'll talk more about throughout this podcast. But it just kind of helps us understand ourselves better, but it also helps us understand others better. And so I think that's one of the things that's really important about assessing ourselves, is not just that we learn about ourselves, but that we also just generally learn about how God has wired different people in different ways. It helps us as we interact with people, especially leaders in our church. It helps with conflict in our leadership team or in our church, and just helps us generally understand each other a lot better when we understand personalities.
That's great. So if I am a particular personality type or have a particular temperament, I understand why I want to do things a certain way, but I'm also able to identify other people's types, is what you're saying, and that helps me work better with them.
Exactly.
One of the instruments you use a lot is the disc, and so we're putting up on the screen some ways that one could take the disc. And so you could go to this particular site. You could take the disc and you'll see they have some fees, usually around $72, which is the full disc, the full version of it. Here's another way that you could take the disc through Resources Unlimited. Now, often in many churches, they'll use a free version of the disc. And so here's a couple of ways that one could go about doing that. And so you could go and you could take the free disc test. And here's even one called the disc assessment test through Open Psychometrics. And so if you've never taken the disc, it might be a good time just to pause this webinar right now. You could go take the free version and they'll immediately give you some results. And what Dr. Ransom's about to speak about will make far more sense, for it's a way to assess yourself, or you can listen in and to what it is that he's about to share, and it may whet your appetite and say, I want to go take that instrument to see a bit about what I'm like. And so why don't we start, Brad, by you explaining a bit about, why the disc is one of the instruments that you give, and then tell us a bit about the disc assessment.
Okay. Yeah, I've been using the disc for a good number of years. It was the first assessment that I ever really started using. And let me just kind of insert here. There are all kinds of personality assessments. The disc, there are lots of versions of it, as you just spoke to, lots of places you can go online and take it. The free version is a good kind of snapshot version. It helps you kind of identify through the results that you'll receive on what your personality type, main type, or blend will be. Then the paid versions, I mean, you do have to pay some for them, but they are a lot more extensive, and they will do a better job in the long run of really honing in on some things, and you get a lot deeper look into your personality. But I would definitely encourage everyone to go online, take the free version. It's a short version that doesn't take very long to take it. And once you take your assessment, you'll be instructed to look at a certain summary. And generally, there are 4-letter types, the D, the I, the S, and the C. And those obviously stand for words. D is dominance, I is influencer, the S is steady, and C is conscientious. A lot of times you'll see 2 letters next to each other. And what that means is that you're a blend. And a large percentage of people are a blend. And so it's really more usual to get a blend than it is to get just a single letter type. But either way, it doesn't matter. And one of the things that is important to understand about any personality assessment is that your personality is who you are. It's how God wired you. It's how God predisposed you to be as a person. And so there's no good or bad personality type. They're just different. And I think that all of us need to understand our personality type, because it definitely helps us in problem solving. It helps us in how we react to the world and how we react to others. But then also another caution that I'll give very quickly before we move into this is that a lot of times we tend to want to use our personality type as an excuse for bad behavior. In other words, a person that is a high D, which so happens to be my main personality type, the dominance, I tend to be pretty competitive, pretty direct, pretty adventurous in a lot of things. I'm very results oriented. I want to see the result right now. And so a lot of times I can move through things pretty quickly without oftentimes thinking about the long-term consequences or thinking about how many people I'm going to mow over in the process of getting this done that I need to get done. And so a person could look at that and say, well, I'm a D, I can't help it. So people just need to understand how I am. And if I'm too direct, that's just too bad. And we need to be careful about that, remembering that there are other people that are S's, for example. An S would be somebody that's very, patient and relaxed, and somebody that is very people oriented. And so it would be very easy for someone with a high D personality to easily and quickly offend somebody that's a high S, for example, just by using my personality in its natural form. And I can oftentimes be too direct, and so I need to learn to dial that back some when I'm dealing with certain people. And so we can't use our personality type as an excuse for bad behavior. We need to also learn to temper certain things so that we can relate to people better. And by understanding ourselves and by understanding others better, then we'll communicate better, we'll problem solve better, we'll deal with conflict better, and all those types of things. So with all of that said, let's look at the just the 4 personality types. And even if a person doesn't go online and take an assessment, you can look at this chart that we have up on the screen right now, and you can kind of self assess. You can look at the various columns and say, most of these fit me. They don't have to all fit you for you to be considered that personality type, but most of them. And so the D, or the dominance, I already went through some of these, but they tend to be very decisive, competitive, daring, direct, innovative, persistent, adventurous, problem solver, and result oriented. They're a lot of times very task oriented, dominant personality. Then the influencer, they're very charming. They're confident. They're convincing, enthusiastic, inspiring, optimistic, persuasive, sociable, trusting. I always jokingly say the influencers are the people that are dancing on a table with a lampshade on their head. They're the ones that have lots of friends. They're the ones that have always have a good time. They're going to find a good time in whatever situation they're in. And then there's the steadiness. And that is a person who's very understanding. They're very friendly. They're usually a good listener, patient, relaxed, sincere, stable, steady. They're a team player. They also are very people oriented, and they're generally the very low key kind of wide base of friendships that are very very deep, and a few friendships are very important to them, more important than a wide base of friendships, if that makes sense. And then the fourth area is conscientious. They're very accurate, precise, analytical, compliant, courteous, diplomatic, detailed, fact finder, objective. They like the lists and the graphs. They're generally the detail people, very detail oriented. And so again, those are the main categories. But again, most people are going to be a blend. And so I mentioned that I'm a D, but I'm actually a DC blend. So I am dominant, but I also have a lot of conscientious traits that come into my personality as well. And so working those together, then that makes up how I generally respond and how I act. On this page here, it gives us a little more information into some of our tendencies. And I will just point out on this particular slide, just to avoid confusing anyone, the blue and the green actually should be reversed on this. Blue is often associated with the steadiness, and green with conscientious. The colors are just reversed in this particular slide. So just wanted to point that out to save any confusion. But someone with a dominant personality, when it comes to their directness and openness of their style, they tend to be direct and guarded, where an influencer tends to be direct and open. Someone with a steady personality tends to be indirect and open. Conscientious tends to be indirect and guarded. And then when our pace and our priority of each style, if you look on the right side, someone that's dominant is going to be fast paced and task oriented. People tell me all the time, I talk way too fast. I'm probably doing that right now. But influence, they're fast paced and they're people oriented. Again, they're going to be the ones that are always having a good time, that always have a large social gathering, those types of things. Steadiness is they're generally slower paced and they're people oriented, and then conscientious are slow paced and task oriented. And so you have these four kind of different things: direct and guarded, direct and open, indirect and guarded. And so how we relate to others is kind of pictured in this particular slide here. Then that's basically the same thing that we just talked about, except I think what I did is I just fixed that slide where I changed the blue and the green around. So we already talked about that one.
That's good. That's good. So we do have some research. We've done a webinar with Kelton Hinton, and he's talked about churches that, he talked about churches that were growing, churches that were plateauing, and churches that were in decline. And so we do see that the personality types have a role there. So like, here's one showing the D's, and he's just talking about how both the D and the I is where you were more likely to have churches that were growing as opposed to declining. Here's a slide that really lays it out, I think, better. He's showing across the board, 100% of the churches that were growing had a personality type of D or I, or had some combination of the two. So we do see that personality ends up having a major role in some of these things. You see about the churches that were plateaued, D or I, 7 of them, and then declining 5 as opposed to S or C. You were having 7 of the declining and 8 of the plateaued, but you also had 8 of the growing that had a S or C in those top 2. So I think that God has created all kinds of different people. I do think if you look at this chart, there are probably more pastors that would be high in one of the letters D or I.
Mm-hmm.
However, if you're not high in D or I, you may be higher in S or C. I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Brad. You just look at what your strengths are and you want to really play to those strengths. And if we think back about what you mentioned a moment ago about the S's and the C's, those are people that are often having deeper relationships. They would be doing more of the pastoral counseling type work, more of those kinds of things. The other aspect is you mentioned like you're a D person as I'm a D person, and I have to come back and can't use that as an excuse. I have to give other people the time to think about and process something. And so one of the things we do with our personality is we know what we're like, but sometimes we stretch or we do something that is not as comfortable for us. So for a D person like Brad and myself, sometimes we're going to stop and we're going to slow down and give other people a chance to process. And then sometimes a person that's high on steadiness or conscientiousness, they may have to strive a little bit or stretch a little bit and do something that is not really within their personality. And I'll just give you one example from Kelton's research is churches that were growing, the pastor visited first-time visitors within 1 to 3 days of the visit. Now that's a hard thing to do if you're not a D or I. If you're more of a S or a C, you're more comfortable going to the hospital. But the folks that were in those growing churches, somehow they got into those homes or they visited those people. And that seemed to be like a key metric in that growth. And that was probably a stretch for the S or C, but if they had D or I, it was kind of a natural thing.
Okay.
Does that pretty much sum up, you think, Dr. Ransom, the DISC profile for our folks for them to think about?
Yeah, and I think that this research here is a good thing for us to realize and look at, that there are certain personality types that seem to be more bent towards a particular thing, whether it's pastoral leadership or whatever. But I do think it is important to emphasize what you've already mentioned, but that just because you're not a D or an I doesn't mean you can't be effective in ministry or an effective lead pastor or whatever. It just means that when it comes to dealing with situations like figuring out how we're going to follow up with guests, or even dealing with leadership in our churches, we need to just understand how we typically would respond to certain things, and then push ourselves out of our comfort zones in certain situations. For example, I use the example quite often in training, when I'm training our church planters, when it comes to leadership and dealing with a team and leading a team. If you are a high S or a high C, your tendency is going to be to lead by consensus, because you want everybody to get along, you want everybody to come on board, and conflict tears you up. Conflict is not fun for D's and C's, or excuse me, S's and C's. And so, but a lot of times, to really lead the way that we need to lead, consensus is good in some situations, but there are times when a leader has to just lead. And so if you're a high S or a high C, you may have to just think about how you're going to frame a conversation when you go into a meeting, or you go to talk to your leaders. Instead of saying, what do you guys think about this? You may have to, which would be your natural tendency, you may have to go into the meeting saying, this is really what I feel like God is leading us to do. So how do we get this accomplished? Instead of letting others make decisions as leaders, even though it may not be our natural tendency through our personalities to go in and be very vocal about our opinion and our ideas to lead sometimes. And that's why I think D's and I's a lot of times are the more effective leaders naturally, because that's just their personality tendency to kind of push that and show that. And where S's and C's might need to spend more time thinking through it beforehand, getting their nerve up before they go into a meeting, and then, reframing in their thoughts so that they can express it when they go into a meeting on how they feel like God has called them to lead. If that makes sense. I think
and it's probably going to be hard for them, as you're saying, but it will probably really help. And especially since they've got that tendency to be consensus builders, it's kind of an outlier when they're doing that, and everybody often senses this is hard for them to do, but it must be the right thing to do, and that way they probably have really accommodated, not a good word in this situation, but for that lack of D&I in this situation, it works out perfectly. And the other thing is, different churches need different things, and they need them at different times. And so it helps to be able to look at where you're at in the process and know what is it that, we need here at this moment. But probably if they can do that D or I activity at that moment, they're probably going to do just fine. They're probably going to do well over the course.
Right.
Well, one more thing we want to mention is a lot of churches use the DISC profile for they're not using it as a spiritual gifts test, but they would use it in that particular process where they're trying to figure out, what people's personality, what their gifts might be. And so that's something to really think about doing, because then you realize who are D's and I's, who are S's and C's, and you really do want a mixture of those in groups, like for deacons and trustees. And you mentioned this earlier, Dr. Ransom, it helps us to realize why they respond the way they do, and take some of the personal aspect out of some of the conflict we may have from time to time,
Right.
Well, another instrument I know you all use is the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So here you could go and you could take it online. It is a bit of a pricey instrument, so you could go and pay for it here. There's another instrument called the Kersey, which also gives you the MBTI type. At one point it was free. Now they do charge you. However, it's not as expensive as the MBTI is, but it's a great instrument, and you guys have used it well, haven't you, Dr. Ransom?
Yes, we started using the MBTI a few years ago. We added it to the DISC because it gives us a little different look into someone's personality. The Myers-Briggs MBTI looks at some things a little bit differently than the DISC does, and so it's helpful for us in our circumstance to use both of them and to look at both of these. So the Myers-Briggs is, in my opinion, it's a little bit deeper, a little bit more technical, I guess, in some ways, and so it gives us like I said, a picture into some other sides that you don't get from the DISC.
Mm-hmm. Let's walk us through the different types and what they mean then.
Okay. Yeah. So the MBTI basically looks at 4 different preference pairs. And what that means is, and the way that I think it's most easily understood is that if you picture a line graph and you have on one extreme of that line graph one letter, and on the other extreme end the other type letter, then you have all these possibilities in the middle. And so you go from 0 to 100% E or 0 to 100% I, and it can fall anywhere within that line. And so this is why another example of self-assessing is important, because you can take the MBTI online or one of the other versions that are free or reduced, And someone may, score a certain preference that maybe they don't feel like really fits them, and it may just be that they would fall lower on that line graph, closer to the middle than they would as an extreme, letter type on the outside. And so the preference pairs are best understood as just that, they're preferences. In other words, if I was to walk up to you, Dr. Moody, and say, hey, I need your signature on this piece of paper, and I handed you a piece of paper, you would automatically pick up a pen with your dominant hand, your preferred hand, to sign that paper. So that's kind of what our personality preferences are. They're just what we naturally default to. But if you had to, I'm right-handed, so if I broke my right arm and I couldn't use it, and I had to sign my name with my left hand, I could do it, but it would be awkward. It would be uncomfortable. It would take me longer. It would probably look like a 3-year-old wrote my name, but I could do it. And that's the way it's important to understand these preference pairs with MBTI. We can, even though we may be wired to act in a certain side of the preference pair, there are certain circumstances and appropriate times when we need to push ourselves away from that, and we need to act in the opposite preference pair. And so when the way we look at these different preference pairs, it's important for us to remember that we're going to naturally fall into one of them, but in certain situations, it's appropriate to act in the other side as well. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go through. But the first one that we often use in the Myers-Briggs preference pairs is the E and the I, which stands for extroversion and introversion. And a lot of times we just think extrovert, we think somebody that's loud and out there and really people friendly and all that. And then we think about the introvert as somebody that's very quiet and all of that. And although that is true, and the characteristics and some of the key words that you see now on the screen would certainly fit in that. The way I like to describe extroverts and introverts is that an extrovert recharges their battery by doing something and being with people. An introvert recharges their battery by withdrawing and by getting away, and you have to get alone sometimes. And so an extrovert, key words that are associated with an extrovert is action, outward, open, interaction, many, expressive, speak. So extroverts are generally, those things, whereas an introvert usually is reflection, inward, private, concentration, few instead of many, quiet, reflects. And a lot of times we often think about, preachers are going to be extroverts, or preachers are going to be, pastors have to be extroverts. But I really think Jesus was an introvert. When you look at the scripture, you see many examples where it says Jesus got away by himself. He went to the mountain. He went to the garden. He went down to the bottom of the boat. Whatever, he had to pull away sometimes. And so it doesn't mean just because you're an extrovert, you're going to be a better leader. Introverts can be very powerful leaders as well. It's just that we are going to associate different things in how we recharge and how we interact and deal with people. So what I always do in this self-assessment is, by looking at those particular descriptions, which do you think that you would fit into? Which one of the preference pairs do you prefer? Do you prefer extroversion or introversion? Again, you can kind of self-assess this by looking at those key words that we looked at just a moment ago in the E and I categories.
Good deal. And there's also sensing and intuition as well that we want to look at.
Right. So sensing and intuition is the second set of preference pairs. And sensing, the key words that are associated with sensing are facts, reality, specific, present, keep, practical, what is. I often explain these as kind of those that prefer sensing like to look at the five, senses. They're very tangible. We deal with, taste, feel, smell, those types of things. Intuition leaves it open to the bigger ideas, imagination, general terms instead of specific terms. They like to dream and think of the future. They're open to change more easily. They're theoretical. They think about what could be. And so sensing would tend to be more concrete, and intuition would tend to be more open, and more receptive to things being different and changing. So again, you can self-assess and you say which one of those sounds more like me. And again, it may not be every one of those descriptors may not fit you, but which one do you feel like you would prefer in the type? And so you have either an E or an I, and then now you have either an S or an N. The third preference pair is thinking and feeling. And so that's the ways that we decide and come to conclusions. And so the thinking preferences is exactly what it sounds like. We are more analytical thinkers, look more at the facts and the figures, and the feelers think more about people, about how it's going to affect other people, and things like that. So if you go to the next slide, the keywords associated with thinking is head, detached, and that means it's not as personal, but we just think about the end result or the end goal, and not necessarily about the people involved. Thinking is things, objective, critique, analyze, firm, fair. But someone who is more on the feeling side, they're going to think with their heart. In other words, they're going to feel instead of think as much. It's very personal. They're very people-oriented, subjective, praise, understand, committed, compassionate. All of those are keywords associated with feelings. So again, self-assess. Which one of those categories seems like it fits you the best? So now you have an EI, an SN, and a TF. So those are the opposite preferences on those three. And then the final one is the JP, judging and perceiving. And personally, I don't like the word judging as well. It kind of gives a negative connotation, but it's not what you think it is, because judging just basically is means that you're organized, more decisive. You like the control of knowing what's going to happen. You're more in the now. Let's take care of this situation. You want closure. You want to be more deliberate. You're a planner. Whereas someone that's on the perceiving side is more flexible. Information, experience, they'll do it later. They like options, are more spontaneous. They can wait. And so on the judging perceiving pair, I often say that you know pretty quickly if you fall in the judging or the perceiving when it comes to taking a trip. If you pack 2 weeks ahead of time and you've got your maps all bookmarked in your Google Maps, and you know exactly where you're going to stop at every hotel and all that, then you're probably going to fall in the judging. But if you want to just go with the flow, you see how it works out, you'll know when you get there kind of thing, you're probably falling the perceiving. So again, you can kind of self-assess. So in general, do you prefer the judging? Do you like things more fixed and more detailed and more organized? Or perceiving, are you more open to being flexible and kind of going with the flow? And so once you do all four of those, then you're going to have a 4-letter type. It's going to either be an EI, will be the first one. The second one is you're going to be an S or an N. And then the third one is the TF. And then the fourth one is the JP. So you're going to get a 4-letter type, such as an ENTJ or an ESFP or an INTP or whatever. So, and each one of those kind of deals with a different segment of our personality and the way that we respond to information, or the way that we look at facts or whatever.
So those, they end up being 16 different types, and
right.
They end up impacting one another, don't they, in a certain way. And we go back to some of the research that Dr. Hinton did. He's got the 16 types that are laid out there. And let's talk about this a little bit. If you see the bold ones, those were the ones that were more likely to have the growing churches, if you will. And so one set was the ESFP. And so you, Dr. Ransom, you already mentioned we tend to think about pastors as being more extroverted. That does come out in this particular research that he did. And you see also the ESFJ was the second part. One of the things we used to say, though, is, extroverts say a lot, but introverts say it better. And
right.
You mentioned Jesus, you see him going off alone. It takes that alone time to be able to develop good sermons and actually good plans and things like that. And so we see this, and we know as a pastor, I have certain things, extroverted type things I have to do. And so I may be introverted, but I'm going to stretch a bit. But that doesn't mean I throw the introverted baby out, because
Right.
that's valuable too.
Sure.
They're both S's in this case, and you were mentioning those are kind of just the facts type people,
Hmm.
whereas the intuitive can sometimes see what can be.
Right.
So anyway, we do see. I think that's, we could see the intuitive, see it go both ways. But I do want to point out, and they were both F's, so they're feeling types.
Hmm.
And I don't know about you, but I tend to be more of a thinker type, and I suspect you may be
Yes.
there too.
Right.
And so I know that, and so I know I have to just be a little softer sometime, or try not to be so blunt, And so you do see the growing folks. I mean, a thinker can offend somebody if they're not
Right.
careful. So,
Absolutely.
so if you're a T, you got to be careful,
Right.
And even with this position, I'll give a little testimony. My wife said, you can't act the way you do at the university she used to say at the church, or and you've got to be more, you've got to let that feeling come out.
Right.
Now, the other thing you mentioned earlier on, Dr. Ransom, was a person could go, both ways. They could be on the middle. And
Hmm.
so you may be a strong E or a strong I, a strong T or a strong F. If you're not a strong one, if you're more like toward the middle, you can work on some of that, and it's not such a stress.
Right.
Let's do the last one. You mentioned J or P, and that you told them that has nothing to do with judging. And I
Right.
liked your analogy. Have you really planned out the trip or not? And so the J's, another part of them is they start things on time, they end on time. It's a sin to come to a meeting late.
Right.
P
Right.
person's like, what?
Exactly. Yeah. Go with the flow. Take it. Take it to the
That's
time.
right.
Yeah.
And you see that had no real bearing at all on growth. Although I might, yeah, I think it's, as a J person, I do think J's important, but P, they take in all the possibilities. But we've got that. Let me throw one more chart that he gave us, and you could see E was very strong. So we know in our culture, you got to do some E type things,
Right.
But I would say to our E guys, you got to have some I time too.
Right.
And then just be careful if you're a thinker, because you see that, like, if you're, probably most of our theologians would be thinkers,
Hmm.
but if you're trying to build a church, that's a dangerous thing.
Right.
That can be dangerous.
Right.
Anything else you want to add on that, Dr.
Yeah,
Prince?
something I've talked to Kelton some about this in times past. One thing that's important to understand too, that's not reflected in this particular research, is that growing church or declining or plateaued church does not just depend on the pastor. It does largely depend on him, but there are other factors, and so that's why we at North American Ministries really emphasize a team approach,
Yes.
and that sort of thing. And a church that has more of a team that's in leadership, and not necessarily multiple staff, because a lot of our churches can't afford multiple staff. But I'm just talking about real leaders that actually are developed into leaders, and that are allowed to lead, and that have accountable, are accountable to the pastor, and those sorts of things can affect these numbers. And so a church could be growing largely because the lead pastor is a great leader, a better leader than he is even a pastor, if that makes sense. In that he has other people in leadership roles that lift him up in his weak areas. And so that's why it's so important to understand that as a leader, I am an extrovert. And so I do have to know that I'm going to be more prone to burnout, because I'm going to burn the candle at both ends. I rank high on the percentage of an extrovert. And so I'm going to go all the time. That's just how I'm wired. And so I need people close to in my inner circle that has permission to say to me, slow down, take it easy. You're running ahead of us. You may be excited about this, but we need time to process this. And so that's not reflected in these numbers. This points just to the pastor, but growing, plateau, declining churches depends more on just the pastor's personality himself. And so that's not reflected necessarily in the numbers that we're looking at, but it is important to understand that there's more to it than just the lead pastor.
Excellent. And we've, on another podcast, have looked at different hats pastors wear. And
right.
One of the hats is the speaker hat. And the growing churches from that standpoint, we're putting a lot of effort into speaking, preaching, and that goes to, so that's more of an I thing, E's and I's are, E's preach too, but as you think about our movement, we've got some I's that have guys, they've written books and so forth, but they're not the ones to be going around patting people on the back and that kind of thing,
Right. Yeah.
That kills them, so what you're saying is know yourself is the way you started it. And also, know someone else is going to fill that situation in your church. And I know a lot of our folks we've got pastors, well, I'm the only person, and we get that. But this does go to working on your team, thinking about your deacons, thinking about your trustees, and then developing leaders, within your church that can fulfill this function. Brad, we did a podcast with you on greeting, so the extroverts, you find you've got extroverts, you put them out as greeters,
Right.
You put you're probably more likely to have trustees and some deacons that are I people and even T, thinkers and so forth. And you definitely want someone on the finance committee that's a J. You've got to have those books organized and those things. And so yourself, and just like you said, you have other people to, kind of pick that up if you're not there.
Right.
Let's talk a real quick, something else that's out there is the Holland Code. You might have heard of the self-directed search or the career key. Again, these are instruments you could go online and you could take. I think the career key used to be $10.99 and the SDS did as well. A lot of kids, same company that has the Myers-Briggs has the strong interest inventory. That's a pricier instrument, but a person could get their Holland Code, or you could go to open source and you could take a free version, but like Dr. Ransom mentioned earlier, not as detailed as like the things you pay for. But real quickly, there are people that are realistic, good with their hands, good with mechanics and computers and things like that. They're investigative types. These folks like to figure things out, science, math, and research. Artistic, your singers, your dramatic types, creative and writing. Social, most of our pastors would be high in the social area, just like being around people, caring about people, reaching people. Enterprising is exactly what you think. The Donald Trumps, the Ross Perot's, the persuaders, the sellers. And so a lot of our D's and I's from the DISC would be high there. And then you've got your conventional, that's the person that's, organized, your treasurer, that you're at the bank, it's the teller. If you're off by a quarter, you might as well be off by $2,500. Set up procedures and accuracy. And so there's another area you might want to look at. And then lastly, even examine the family dynamics, because you can see some of this. A big part of what we've talked about is genetics, and so you can see it played out in different roles through your history, your family history. Of course, when we think about Abraham, what a family dynamic that was. But you can see certain moral problems, like the problem with Isaac, repeated. But you can also see these types of personality aspects, and that can help us see how we might respond and help us as we go forward. Is there anything else you think of, Dr. Ransom, we should share with them before we close out today?
Well, the only thing I would say is, if you get into this and find it helpful and would like, more information or like some help in interpreting results or whatever, as time allows, I'm certainly always willing to help any way that I can. And so feel free to reach out to me at North American Ministries, and I'll be happy to help any way that I can.
That's good. And so anyone listening, we're here to help. We're here to provide resources. You can reach out to Dr. Ransom. You can send questions to us at questions@nafwb.org. And maybe you're trying to set up, something where you evaluate or you kind of plan for ministry in your church. We're here to help. We're here to serve and help our folks be as effective as they possibly can be. So just reach out to us and look at some of our other information that we have at our YouTube channel. We encourage you to subscribe and to get the materials at nafwb.org. And then we have our program Refresh. We'll be adding more material there. So check those things out, but lots of different resources that you can use in your ministry, in your particular districts and associations and states. And so thank you, Dr. Ransom, for joining us today. Would you mind saying a prayer for our pastors and churches before we sign off?
Absolutely. Love to. All right, Father, thank you so much for the time that we've been able just to share these things. And Lord, I know we've shared a lot of information very quickly, and I pray that you would just give all of us and our listeners clarity and understanding as we try to navigate through really the way that you created us. We know, Lord, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. There is so much more to our bodies, our psyche as individuals than we could ever imagine. And it's because you're a great God and because you're a big God and you have created us in such a magnificent way that many of us are just barely scratching the surface of really understanding how our bodies are created, how our minds work. And so by understanding ourselves better, Lord, may we serve better, may we minister better, may we deal with other people in a better way that would ultimately honor you. So help us, Lord, as we just think through these things, that we would think with an understanding that comes from you, that you would give us the wisdom that we need to understand ourselves and understand others, ultimately for your glory and for your honor. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Dr. Ransom. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.